Our life is a journey toward God. Longing for our true home, we search for God. In his autobiography, the 20th century English monk Bede Griffiths writes about the 15 to 17,000 year old cave paintings discovered in Lascaux, France. At the end of long, meandering, and dangerous underground tunnels through the darkness, there are 600 painted and drawn animals in a cavern that is 66 feet wide and 16 feet high. Scholars believe that these sacred images provided a means for people to enter into communion with the holy, and that the long passageway represented the difficulty of approaching the holy mystery. Through all of human existence, people have created calendars and holy places, stone circles, altars, tombs, and pyramids. Human beings have prepared themselves to come into the divine presence by dancing, fasting, praying, and lighting candles. And that journey from the mouth of the cave to the dark interior is the passage from the outer world into the inner world. The Greek philosopher Plato writes that we are like people in a cave looking at shadows on the wall, not knowing the reality that they refer to. And our life is like this. We understand God, reality, one another through symbols. When it comes to God, we often mistake the symbol for the thing in itself. That's called idolatry. A modern version of this is to think that science can tell us the meaning of things, that it can answer questions like whether or not we have free will, or whether or not we are in love. A sense for the mystery transcending the world lies at the heart of all religions. The symbols help us to come into the presence of that holy reality, which is our true home. Now, one of the most peculiar, to me, symbols in the Christian faith is this feast that we celebrate today, the reign of Christ. We celebrate it today on the last Sunday of the Christian year, and people in our church have only celebrated this since 1970. And I've always felt a kind of ambivalence about this feast, in part because after the French Revolution, the Roman Catholic Church in the 19th century did so much to oppose the democratization of Europe. It's hard for me to get past that history. But Pope Pius XI, in the year 1925, instituted the feast for Roman Catholics. And in his encyclical, right after the aftermath of World War I, he wrote about how important it is that nationalism and secularization don't get too tight a hold of us. He hoped that the faithful people would regard Christ as the true king and not the nation as the true determinant of our life. And it turns out to be a timely message for us, doesn't it? To think of Christ as the real king. We have Christian nationalists in the United States who want to conflate Christianity and the nation in a way that's terribly destructive and ultimately so much against the teachings of Jesus himself. The values of Jesus have nothing to do with white nationalism or Christian nationalism, and this is so true and so obvious from our gospel today. In almost his last days, Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives, and he's there with his friends. And his friends ask him, they say, what are the end times going to be like? And Jesus doesn't so much talk about the end times, but he gives 3 parables to talk about how we should really live in the present. That the end times, the purpose of thinking about them is to understand how we should live now. And so he tells them the parable of the bridesmaids. And in it, Jesus teaches us to live joyfully and wisely. One might say today, mindfully. Then Jesus tells the parable of the talents. And this is to encourage people to be daring with their lives, focused on how our life can bear fruit. And then finally today, he tells the story of the sheep and the goats. Now, the purpose of this is not to frighten us, to strike our hearts with terrors, but to show us what a blessing generosity and compassion are. In Paul's first letter to the Romans, he writes so famously, and now faith, hope, and love abide, these 3, and the greatest of these is love. And Jesus makes a similar point. Ultimately, your nationality, your religion, what you believe, whether or not you're a Christian, whether or not you come to church, whether or not you are faithful to your faith, these are far less important than being a person who is dedicated to love, especially loving what Jesus called the least of these. Now, on Tuesday at the Interfaith Breakfast, Speaker Emerita Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, was there, and when she is looking for a way to talk about faith, this is the story that she uses. And I would encourage us too. This is a story of genuine faith, what it really means to follow Jesus. And yet the parable of the sheep and goats does have a certain subtlety. For me, it cannot simply be reduced to the transactional idea that only good people enter into the kingdom of heaven, that you have to do something good in order to be accepted by God. In Jesus' story, at the end of the age, all the nations are gathered together before the throne. And Matthew writes, quote, "The Son of Man will separate them one from another." And to me, that Greek word for they, them, it seems to refer to the nations, not to individuals, so that the Son of Man is judging nations or groups of people rather than individuals. And isn't that a different way of looking at faith than thinking that each of us individually is judged, but that we're judged as a group? The people being judged did not have an ulterior motive in their earlier actions. So they feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, welcome the stranger, give the naked clothing. They take care of the sick and they visit prisoners. And they don't do this out of some expectation that they're going to be rewarded in the future. They do it out of compassion, not to gain favor from God. They love people for their own sake. And then they are surprised to learn that what they did to the least of these, they did to the Son of Man. Now, another way to look at this is that God made sheep and goats. The purpose is not for a sheep to become a goat or a goat to become a sheep. It's not like their good deeds somehow changed what kind of beings they are. Every human being we encounter is an unrecognized Jesus. Every person is God's beloved child. I don't believe that God destines some people to eternal suffering. I also know there have been times when I have passed by the naked and the hungry and the stranger and not helped, just as there have been times when I've helped the naked, the stranger, and the lone. We are both sheep and goats at different moments in our life. And that point is that our compassion, our goodness, this gives pleasure to God. And there is something in every human being that is divine. So what we're talking about is a kingdom not of domination, but a kingdom of servanthood. And this is the kind of king we celebrate in Jesus today. Now, I want to talk about one more thing before I wrap everything up. And I want to talk rather at length about a king and a queen in our church calendar. They are the King Kamehameha IV and Queen Emma. They were married, and we celebrate their feast day on Tuesday of this week. And I want to tell you a little bit about them, because they are, to me, a model of what it means to reign in Christ, in the way of Christ. So the two of them, they were born in 1834 and 1836, and the two of them went to the same small school together, because all the royal children in the island, in the kingdom of Hawaii, went to the same school. So they knew each other from the time they were like 7 years old, Emma and Kamehameha IV. And as the crown prince, when he grew up and left school, the crown prince went and traveled widely around the world. He traveled in England, in France, and here in America, he was terribly treated because he's a dark-skinned person. And so people, American racists, called him names. They played tricks on him. They treated him very poorly. People would refuse to serve him. And so he always carried this memory. He said, that he was treated in the United States so badly in a way that he just never had been treated in England or in France. And it affected his realm. It affected how he cared for his people. It made him cautious about the American influence on the Hawaiian kingdom. Now, Emma's grandfather was King Kamehameha's brother, the first. So the king who united the Hawaiian Islands, his brother was her grandfather, and her grandfather was her great-grandfather. Her grandfather was the Englishman who helped King Kamehameha as kind of his assistant. And so she was adopted by an English family, an English father and a Hawaiian wife. The English father was a doctor, and so she saw how people were suffering in the islands. And the two of them, they cared. They wanted to institute the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church in Hawaii, because they wanted to counterbalance the influence of the American missionaries who were there. They wanted a form of Christianity that was different, and the two of them loved this faith. They would love being here today. The things that we're doing are things that they would have enjoyed so much. And so King Kamehameha IV actually translated the Book of Common Prayer from English into Hawaiian. And the two of them were passionate about the church, the cathedral in Honolulu. It's built on the land that they gave to the church. So imagine what it was like there in the middle part of the 19th century. 4 out of every 5 Hawaiians had died as a result of introduced diseases. And so the two of them cared also deeply about introducing Western medicine so that fewer people would die. And so the two of them wanted to start a hospital. And the hospital is still there today. And as they did it, they didn't have enough money to do it. And so one day, Queen Emma went out and she got her notebook and she was getting ready to go out on the town. And King Kamehameha said to her, where are you going? And she said, well, I'm going to get money to build this hospital. And he said, well, it looks unseemly to have the queen out begging for money. And so she said, well, they will think it's this. She said, they won't think it's unseemly. They will think this is important enough that we don't rest on false pride. And so then in response, the king said, my dear, if you are that determined, I will go as your representative. And so the king went out among the common people with a notebook and took everybody's pledges to support that new hospital. And that hospital is still there, Queen's Hospital in Honolulu. The two of them also started a school for boys called Iolani. They started a school for girls called St. Andrew's Priory. They cared intensely about helping Hawaiian people to understand the modern world so that it would be educated and prepared for life in the future. The two cared so much about ancient Hawaiian ways, but they recognized the importance of modernization, that the world was changing, that Hawaiians need to be ready for it. So this may have been their greatest strength, that the two of them were able to humble themselves for the sake of their people. And perhaps that is what makes a sovereign most like Christ the King. Late in life, the poet Denise Levertov became a Christian, and all along she had sensed something calling to her. And this is a poem she wrote when she was younger called The Secret. 2 girls discover the secret of life in a sudden line of poetry. I, who don't know the secret, wrote the line. They told me through a third person. They had found it, but not what it was, not even what line it was. No doubt by now, more than a week later, they have forgotten the secret, the line, the name of the poem. I love them for finding what I can't find, and for loving me, for the line I wrote, and for forgetting it, so that 1,000 times, till death finds them, they may discover it again in other lines, in other happenings, and for wanting to know it, for assuming there is such a secret, yes, for that most of all. Sometimes it feels like we are in a long, meandering tunnel going through the darkness. And this poem is about those moments when the meaning of our life seems clear, and the knowledge that while this experience will not last, it will be replaced by another. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of the reign of Christ, and for remembering the life of King Kamehameha IV and Queen Emma. May our dream be realized, of a kingdom not of domination, but of servanthood. Our life is a journey toward the Holy One. Longing for our true home, we search for God. So let us live joyfully, wisely, mindfully, with daring, bearing the fruit of generosity and kindness. And let every person we encounter be for us Christ the King, who always draws us more deeply into the truth.